Welcome to this evening's seminar on alternative provision, Who is it for? I'm Alice Toole, I'm one of the co-investigators on the Excluded Lives project, and I'll be chairing tonight's event. So before I introduce our panel for this evening, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes setting the scene for tonight's seminar. So while we had hoped to discuss both alternative provision in England and Wales, we'll be focusing more on England this evening, as we were unsure whether our Welsh colleagues would get here due to the train strikes. We will, however, present findings from the Excluded Lives project, which covers all 4 of the UK jurisdictions at future events. And if you have any particular questions that you were dying to ask about alternative provision in Wales today, please feel free to either add them to the chat or email us afterwards, and we'll do our best to respond. So, what is alternative provision? So alternative provision is defined by the Department for Education as education arranged by local authorities for pupils who, because of exclusion, illness, or other reasons, would not otherwise receive suitable education. It's also education arranged by schools for pupils on a fixed period exclusion and pupils being directed by school to off-site provision to improve their behaviour. So we know from our research on the Excluded Lives project that the landscape of provision is complex and can vary geographically. Alternative provision is an umbrella term that includes a range of different providers, including registered providers, such as AP academies and pupil referral units, as well as unregistered providers, providers that have been through some form of approval by a local authority quality assurance process, and those that haven't. The courses on offer can range from studying for GCSEs and functional skills qualifications to outdoor learning, therapeutic interventions, and vocational and practical courses like car mechanics and hairdressing, to name just a few. So depending on the type of provider and the reason for referral, placements can be short or long-term, provided on a part-time or full-time basis, and focused on early intervention or reintegration. It's also important to note that hospital schools fall under the umbrella of AP, and I'm pleased to see that we have some hospital school teachers in the audience. So there's been much debate around alternative provision for a number of years now, with attention being paid to issues such as commissioning and funding, accountability, inspection, regulation, and the quality of AP, as well as pupil outcomes, the disproportionate representation of particular groups of pupils within AP, as well as pressures on places due to increasing numbers of permanent exclusion. And I'm sure tonight's panel members will pick up on some of these areas during their presentations. So much research, including research conducted by some of our panel members, has also focused on the strengths and limitations of AP, as well as the experiences of young people attending AP and the factors perceived by young people as enabling or impeding their achievement of positive academic and social emotional outcomes. More recently, with the publication of the SEND and AP Green Paper, focus has turned to the increasing number of young people with complex needs entering alternative provision, as well as understanding the use of unregistered providers. Commentators, such as Joe Hutchinson from the Education Policy Institute, have drawn attention to the incentives faced by schools to demand ever more places in alternative provision as a release valve for pressures in school funding and increasing attainment expectations and accountability, as well as increasing pressures on specialist places. Similar points were made following the Education Select Committee's inquiry into alternative provision in 2018 and the publication of the report Forgotten Children, Alternative Provision and the Scandal of Ever-Increasing Exclusions. This has led to debates over the remit of AP, whether or not the sector needs expanding, and questions being asked about how and why young people enter alternative provision, how placement decisions are made, and the extent to which placements are needs-led. A blog written in response to the Green Paper proposals by my colleague, Professor Jill Porter, explores some of these points further and can be found on the Excluded Lives website. So it's against this backdrop and these debates that we pose the question for tonight's seminar: who is alternative provision for? And relatedly, what purpose and whose interests does it serve? So it's at this point I'll hand over to our 5 panel members, who will each in turn respond to the question, alternative provision, who is it for? Each panel member will speak for up to 10 minutes, and then we should have about half an hour left for questions. So first we'll hear from Dan Owen, who is joining us via Zoom. So Dan is a former senior Her Majesty's Inspector for Ofsted, and Dan has led inspection policy and acted as special advisor to the 2019 framework, as well as leading Ofsted's work on off-rolling, bringing together Ofsted, the Department for Education and the Children's Commissioner's Office to improve the lives of marginalised students across England. He is now Director of Secondary Education at the Windsor Academy Trust. Up second, we have Sarah Johnson, also joining us on Zoom. Sarah is President of PRUSAP, an organisation which represents PRUs and APs from regions across England, and consultant at Phoenix Education. Sarah has recently published a book titled Behaving Together in the Classroom, A Teacher's Guide to Nurturing Behaviour, and is currently completing her PhD on belonging in alternative provision. Following Sarah, we have Andrew Malcolm in the room, who is lecturer in applied social studies at the University of Bedfordshire. Andrew has experience of teaching in a variety of educational settings, in particular working with pupils marginalised and excluded from mainstream schooling. In his doctoral research, he focused on the educational experiences of those who attend alternative provision settings and the impact of these experiences on their future development. He's written many journal articles on alternative provision, including exclusions and alternative provision, piecing together the picture, which makes the case for clearer reporting on alternative provision. We then hear from Jody Parnacia.
Well done.
I asked how to pronounce that earlier. Jody began her career working in learning support roles in mainstream and alternative schools, and is now senior lecturer in youth studies at Nottingham Trent University. Jody is co-author of the report, What's the Alternative? A Study Exploring Quality in Alternative Provision, which was funded by the Prince's Trust. And concluding our panel, we have Jenny Graham, who has recently joined The Difference, which is a registered charity that delivers leadership courses and professional development on inclusion for senior school leaders as head of research, having previously worked for many years doing research and evaluation for the government and other third sector organisations. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dan. Thank you.
Hi, Alice. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Super duper. So I'm not going to speak for 10 minutes. It will be less than 10 minutes. And that means that hopefully people will be able to ask more questions at the end and get a dialogue and a conversation going. And thank you very much for inviting me tonight. To answer the question, who is AP for? I'll give a really simple one-line answer. And that is AP is for all of us. That's who AP is for. AP is for all of us in society. And the quality of alternative provision across the system should show us who we are as a society and who we are as an education sector, in my view. AP is where some of our most vulnerable pupils end up. Unfortunately, some of our most vulnerable pupils actually don't end up in alternative provision because that alternative provision isn't available to them because of the high variability of availability of decent alternative provision in various areas. In some areas of the country, you're really, really, really lucky if you have a decent provider within 10 miles of your school or your home if you end up needing to go to alternative provision. And alternative provision as a sector is just so diverse, and it ranges from large operators to small. There's state funded, there's independent, there's the tiny unregistered providers, there's the school of guinea pigs that I've had the benefit of going to, where all of the rough young lads, they're not rough once they've gotten a guinea pig in their lap. You'd be amazed at how much English a guinea pig holding boy can do. The range of things that AP contains is one of the problems that we have. To define it is really, really difficult as a sector, and parts of it are invisible. But actually, the sector of alternative provision is where we should see the very, very best of what we can deliver, not the most fragmented, not the worst, not the dangerous sort of places that some of our pupils end up in, but the very best, because it's what defines us. These pupils in AP are the canaries in the mine. So having to think about the quality, what quality do we see? Well, we do see some absolutely stonking alternative provision that makes a huge difference to children's lives. And isn't that a joy? And we probably don't talk about that alternative provision enough. I'll tell you what, we certainly don't talk about the unregistered provision. The unregistered provision sometimes doing an absolutely amazing job that never gets any airtime because no one ever even looks through the doors. Doing some wonderful work with pupils. I'll talk a little bit more about that unregistered provision in a minute. But the sector ranges from the unregistered schools that are actually operating unlawfully because they meet the definition of a school but haven't registered. Some of them doing a good job potentially, some of them potentially not. So those registered schools that are lawful, to the unregistered schools that are still lawful because they're not operating as a school, to some provision that's utterly horrific. Some of which we hear about, some of which I have visited, some of which we see pictures of out there when the news items come out. We've then got the issue of alternative provision from alternative provision, and this is where things start getting a bit more invisible. So a pupil ends up in an alternative provision, and sometimes their school doesn't even know where they're going because they'll potentially be going to this place on paper, but they'll be farmed out to 5 or 6, 7 different places. They may never even attend that single site where they're supposed to be going, and sometimes schools don't even know about that. And of course, alternative provision often causes, because of the state of the sector, a lot of travel to get to the good places, but sometimes a lot of travel to even get to those mediocre alternative provisions. So why is alternative provision for all of us? Well, if we took a utilitarian point of view, alternative provision where we enable pupils who just aren't coping or need some early intervention to make sure that they can, where we get them into really decent alternative provision, when we get the guinea pigs in their laps to help them calm and to help them to make progress within the curriculum, that is absolutely superb. And that helps us economically. Those pupils, if they do well, are more likely to be economically productive. And some people will tell you that that will even lower the crime rate and be a lower cost to the state. And I don't really have that utilitarian point of view. That's the sort of thing that often comes out in reports about alternative provision and other things where we assess a policy in the sector and say, oh, this is a great idea because it'll save money overall. And we're all really worried about saving money right now, aren't we? I think alternative provision is there to break cycles of social deprivation. I think it's also there to create happiness. Because as a community, every single young person deserves an education that meets their needs. And some young people don't find that they can have their needs met within the school that they end up going to. And so what are we looking for? We're looking for all young people to thrive. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for an environment within which they can thrive, in which they can become themselves and build themselves so that, hopefully, they would be able to have some alternative provision and actually go back to where they were before. And that's one of the problems around alternative provision is, well, what is it for? And this comes to that question about how it ought to be monitored and whether the inspection system we have currently is fit for purpose. Because unless we know what alternative provision is actually for the individual child, we don't know how we ought to monitor it, and we don't really know what we ought to think about it. So for some pupils, if alternative provision is to get them back to where they were before, that will be a very different menu of activities that would involve curricular continuity. If we've got a pupil that hasn't been in school for a long period of time, actually socializing them into an environment where they meet other people of their own age or just meet other people might be the key thing that they need to thrive. So it becomes really difficult to actually judge the quality on the basis of one concept of what is needed from alternative provision. It's even harder when lots of that alternative provision is hidden because it's unregistered. Therefore, no one's going to regulate it. No one's going to inspect it. No one's going to peek through those doors. That becomes really difficult. And also when we get the alternative provision farmed out from alternative provision to try often to do the best thing to meet those pupils' needs, and we don't have a line of sight as to where that pupil is, of course, we've got all sorts of safeguarding problems that come around that. So in order for all pupils to thrive, we have to have them in the right places. We have to be ready, willing, and able to give them the right alternative provision that sometimes doesn't exist, but sometimes where it does, it's dangerous, and sometimes where it does, it's unseen. So what do we need to do about it? Well, we need to make the invisible visible. We need to know where all of our children and young people are and take responsibility for their thriving as a society, not because it's going to lower a crime rate or cost us less in the NHS, but because it's the right thing to do to make sure that all young people thrive, that there's somewhere that they can, that we care about them enough to be regulating and inspecting all of the places that they go to. I think we need to be really clear on the purpose of alternative provision in every single case, and that helps regulation, I think, and accountability. I think that's really important. And we need to rapidly make much safer all of the alternative provision that pupils go to, because where they're going to registered and well-established provision, where, you know, there's ways in which they can get there very easily, you know, that's all well and good. But too often, where there's none of that provision around, a school where it finds itself not able to meet pupils' needs is looking around and saying, well, how far has this child got to travel to get them to something? They end up getting a very small number of hours of provision a day. So making the invisible visible, being really clear on the purpose, making sure that it's all safe. And my view, I don't speak for the inspectorate and I don't speak for the department, but my view is that anywhere a pupil goes to be educated, I don't want to get into the conversations about religious education and those kinds of things, but their main education should be within the purview of an organisation that makes sure it's safe and makes sure it meets those pupils' needs. These are the pupils that need the most from us, not the least. AP is for everyone because everyone deserves to thrive. And when all of us thrive, communities thrive, and families thrive, and it's a great place to be. It's not because we want to save money or make money. It's because we believe, and I hope, you know, everyone across the sector does, that it's actually about more than just economic prosperity and a utilitarian point of view. It's about communities and individuals thriving and being the best that they can be and better.
Thank you, Dan. That's great. And you did say you would be under 10 minutes and you were, so that's perfect. Can we hand over now to Sarah?
Thank you very much. I always really hate following Dr. Dan Owen because it makes whatever I say, I have to rewrite my notes as soon as he starts speaking. Dan spoke about the idea that AP is for everyone. There's some bits that I agree with and there's some bits that I'm going to kind of draw attention to kind of consider a slightly different approach. I think AP can be for anybody, but at the moment it's for children with disrupted education. It has been disjointed, it's been interrupted, and it's been fragmented. I was trying to, on this map, think about the different ways that children enter into alternative provision or pupil referral units. And yes, we can absolutely talk about the 6-day provision where the local authority has a statutory obligation to make sure that child's needs are met. We can also talk about the statutory obligation the local authority to make sure that children with medical needs have education as well. But actually, all too often what you find is the only experiences that unite these various different children is actually their interrupted and fragmented education provision instead. And so from my perspective, who alternative provision is for those children where there's been huge disruptions to their education. And from my perspective, what that means is that alternative provision should provide the consistency and the stability that those vulnerable children desperately need. For me, AP is a cornerstone of the education system. It needs to be a continuum of provision. And sometimes I talk about my previous experiences of growing up and alternative provision. I turned 40 on Monday, so this is a while ago that I'm talking about. My older brother was excluded from school, so this was probably about 25 years ago now, and there was no specific alternative provision for my older brother. So what that meant for him is when he was excluded from school, there was no alternative provision. There was no education service for him at all. And what happened instead is he had lots of time on his hands, and then eventually, before he was arrested and imprisoned in the what was called Borstal at the time. Alternative provision should have been for him. It should have been able to kind of capture him and support him and hopefully prevent that narrative into prison. Unfortunately, it wasn't there. So who is it for? I'm going to change the question a little bit and say, who should it be for? Because I like to subvert things in a way. So for me, who should it be for? It should be preventative. The AP should be part of the continuum of provision and support to support those children and embedded as a planned offer for children that might struggle in mainstream, rather than waiting for children to get to crisis point, finding things difficult, being excluded from school, either after their 5th day where they need education provided by the school, or if they have a permanent exclusion 6-day provision. Actually, wouldn't it be great if we got those children and supported them at the start of their need rather than the crisis point? And I've used the image of a vaccination with this idea that actually it should be to prevent those exclusions in the first place, or if it's not just about exclusion, prevent the need for children to have the need for medical pupil referral units to support their needs, things like anxiety or psychosis or epilepsy. I understand that obviously children that might be neutropenic and have cancer might need the alternative provision to support their needs. But it should also be about supporting staff in mainstream schools. So alternative provisions shouldn't just be about the children, but should be about staffing structures and continual professional development as well. And it should be around those issues pertaining to collaboration. How do we develop our colleagues in mainstream and share practice about including young people and thinking about behavioural support systems and so on? I also think that yes, AP has a place for being reactionary. You don't get rid of your first aid box. You shouldn't have hurt yourself in the first place. I'm going to get rid of my plasters. We know that AP and PRUs have a place to respond to crisis. And that might be those permanent exclusions. It might be those children moving from local authority to local authority and their needs haven't been picked up in the same way in one local authority. And it talks a little bit to what Dan was saying around that kind of higher variability and support in different areas. That actually what you find is that some children might move from one local authority to another and need a lot of support for lots of different reasons. And that might be that they're involved in gang culture, for example. They might be being exploited in that regards and so on. So actually, yes, AP also has a place in being reactionary, being that plaster when things haven't gone as they ought to be. AP is also about our statutory responsibilities as an education system. It's those children with medical needs where schools, for whatever reason, can't provide that continuity of education, as well as that 6-day provision. And in terms of who's it for, well, actually, I think, as I mentioned, I don't think AP is just for children. I think it is for educational professionals as well and staff. It's about improving the overall system. It's also about supporting children returning to school. So the idea, that model of a revolving door of supporting children returning to school is a vital component of supporting children. It's about transition as well. It's about building capacity of mainstream schools to be able to know how to write individual healthcare plans, be able to understand what it means for children with emotional-based school avoidance as well. But there's lots of challenges to that. There's loads of challenges to that. And I think in the current system that we're now working with in, you know, I hate the phrase, that kind of post-COVID world, and I don't think we are particularly post-COVID at the moment, is that there's challenges there about where does special end and AP begin, or is it AP begin and goes into special? What is it different about children with special educational needs with perhaps social, emotional, mental health that means that actually their needs could be better met within that kind of consistent approach within a special school with particular curriculum arrangements for those children compared to alternative provision? And I think that's a challenge that hopefully, you know, we will talk to during this panel discussion as well. And the other challenge is, whilst I mentioned about this plaster, about being reactionary, is it actually about filling in the gaps? Are there gaps in mainstream education that aren't being met and they should be being met within mainstream, that actually we're just filling the gap where we've kind of evolved? You know, AP hasn't necessarily been designed as part of a kind of consistent, coherent offer, but it's evolved and been an add-on rather than design. But also, there's a moral imperative there. In terms of alternative provision, the moral imperative of inclusion and inclusive education is that actually we need to make sure that AP isn't a kind of Cinderella service, that it's well established, that the premises are considered deeply, that allows for an enriching and engaging and alternative curriculum if that's what children need, but also that we don't just use it because we don't want these sorts of children in our schools. It's really important that we see children, that we don't other them, and the idea is that actually we're going to support them through perhaps their crisis, or to support them developing better skills in order to manage in mainstream, but also we develop the schooling staff as well, that we don't just see it as a problem sitting within the child directly, but go actually, what are the issues within the system that's leading to exclusions? And Dan didn't do this, so I feel really bad. But if you want to connect to Prusac, please feel free to follow us on Twitter. And we've got a conference as well on the 11th of November that you're welcome to attend, where we're going to talk about issues relating to mental health. And I think I was under 10 minutes as well. If you imagine that I had a normal speed of talking, it was probably 10 minutes.
That was perfect, thank you. After that, we will hand over to Andy. I think you have to stand here if you're happy to, or I can try and move this. Thank you.
Super. It's great to be here with you. I think there are going to be things that others have mentioned, and kind of trying to avoid stepping on each other's toes in terms of what we're saying too much. But I think there is a really important extent which Dan kind of covered. There's an extent to which, yes, AP and who it is for is all of us, like a measure of the quality of any society is how it looks after those who have had a rough time in life. And I think that is really important, and that is often what we're talking about when we talk about AP settings. But I would also say, I think particularly Sarah reflects this a little bit, there is an increasing tendency, I think it is an increasing tendency in kind of government policy and rhetoric and some narratives around alternative provision to view alternative provision as a necessary part of an inclusive system within which exclusion happens, and it is important that it happens in certain circumstances, and it's kind of positioned as for the sake of the other 30 children. I think there are some real challenges that view and the development of that view brings to the education system. I think there are some real ways in which AP, and really good quality AP, that supports children and young people and changes their horizons, their expectations about what's possible and what they're doing and what their life is like and the challenges that they face, and like really engaging with them relationally, which is what often happens in alternative provision settings, is a real challenge to the mainstream system, and actually trying to integrate, I suppose, or bring an interactive conversation there between really good practice in AP that foregrounds relationships, and using that to challenge some aspects of the mainstream system and support inclusive practice. So we're not just saying, actually, you're out of here for the needs of the other 30 people. So I think it's really interesting and important to notice. But at the same time, saying that, I would also say there's a socio-historical account of truancy and school exclusion, truancy and compulsory schooling, written by Dennis Gleeson many years ago now. And there are occasionally just phrases that stick in your mind when you read things. And one of them for me is truancy and compulsory schooling are flip sides of the same coin. So in any compulsory education system, you're always going to have children who don't easily fit within that education system or don't engage with it. There's going to be a dynamic along those lines. And I think from my perspective, I worked in alternative provision before studying it, and I'm continuing to study it now. And I think it will exist in some form or other. I think there's an extent to which the education system as a whole can be more exclusionary, less exclusionary, more inclusive, etc., etc. However, I think it is likely to exist in some form or other, and that's what I'm interested in studying. I was asked in particular to talk about outcomes, so I'll try and get onto that in a bit. But in terms of who it's for, I was also asked to talk about the kind of youth justice, or the extent to which young people in AP are involved in crime. And I looked up some of the detail that I had read before, but 41% of pupils in AP have ever been cautioned or sentenced, and 15% of pupils in AP are prolific offenders. However, if you look at the whole population of prolific offenders, 57% of prolific offending young people are in AP. So a significant proportion of those who are prolific offenders are in AP, but of AP in the round, only 15% of pupils in AP. So AP isn't full of prolific offenders, but they're a significant subgroup. And I think it comes back to what Sarah was saying again about it's a really diverse, and Dan was saying as well, it's a really diverse sector that holds a lot of kind of different groups together. My initial doctoral research, where I talked to young people who had been in AP but who were in their 20s or thereabouts, there were some really common experiences that came up again and again. So bullying was something that a lot of them talked about. Experiencing special educational needs or difficult disabilities, medical needs as well. Experiences of stressful life events, so experiencing being in care or on the cusp of care, but other things like grief, loss, those kind of stressful life events. And then a category that kind of took me a little while to name, but I ended up calling it difficulties with authority. So just being part of like a culture that doesn't engage easily perhaps with being in a system within the mainstream educational system where I think it's arguable, and I did argue this, that you have to embody a level of insignificance and inferiority in relation to that system. You have to be where you're told to be at a certain time, and you have to say, oh yeah, that's what happened. The teacher's saying that's what happened. I have to agree, that's what happened. Like, you're not significant in the system often, I think. Yeah, so those, I guess I would say, are some of the groups. In terms of outcomes, I'd kind of be more inclined to look at destinations than to think about academic outcomes, because there's a huge difference there. Another quote that sticks with me from reading was something from the Rees Centre, where they looked at the outcomes of children looked after, but they talked about AP in particular, and essentially said there is powerful sorting in the English education system, because there's no other explanation for how the outcomes of pupils who end up in AP are so much poorer than those who remain in mainstream. So in terms of outcomes, I think I would focus on reintegration. I would focus on post-16 destinations for those who complete their education in AP. And I would also say there's a really important extent to which just being supported through turbulent life events and challenging life circumstances whilst you're in AP, if you're a young person in that setting, is really important as well as like an outcome that is really difficult to measure and probably isn't going to be measured. So I think, you know, the things that aren't going to be measured are reintegration and post-16 outcomes. In terms of reintegration, it has been an express kind of policy intention ever since the Elton report of 89, I think it was. So for over 30 years, reintegration has kind of been talked about. There's no data. The government does not collect any data or publish any data on rates of reintegration. I think that's really interesting, because you can have some very clear narratives around, you know, AP is there for pupils to transition out of mainstream school into for a brief period before transitioning into a special school or transitioning back into mainstream, but there's no real tracking of what actually goes on there. And, you know, there are reported rates, but, you know, large surveys of like 40 LAs suggest that up to Key Stage 3, maybe 64% of young people are integrated, and around 50% in year 10 and only 10% in year 11, which kind of makes sense because they're towards the end of their school careers. But it seems from the research that there needs to be a relationship between the mainstream school and the alternative provision setting. The mainstream school needs to kind of retain responsibility for that young person and see them as part of the school community. There's some work that Jody, I think, wrote about critiquing the repair and return model. So, you know, pushing pupils out of mainstream school into AP for them to be repaired so that they can come back and just fit into the system. Like, I think the system needs to be challenged if reintegration is to be successful. And then in terms of post-16 destinations, I've got some copies of paper, because I'm going to run out of time, 6 to 10 minutes, that I had published recently, where I looked at really quite variable rates of post-16 success. So I think the average is 56%, but if you look at the individual institutions for alternative provision, and some of this will come down to very different pupil cohorts, there varies kind of between 20 or so percent and 80 or so percent in terms of the proportion of students going on to a sustained destination in terms of post-16 education for the 2 terms after leaving. I've done some other analysis that suggests that those initial rates can reduce quite significantly over time. It's actually by year 3 that you probably want to be looking to judge as to whether someone's got a sustained destination or not. And actually 40% of pupils from an AP setting having a sustained destination is upper quartile, and 25% or less is lower quartile performance in terms of a sustained destination 3 years after leaving AP. Around 1 in 20, so 5% of pupils from AP end up in HE a few years down the line. I think that's actually quite important to recognise and take into account when working in AP settings. Yeah, there were some really important things that came out of this study that I did looking at data, because then I talked to settings with high levels of performance and low levels of performance and mid levels of performance. Not got time to talk through that now, but I think one of the things was tracking pupils, so taking an active interest and an ongoing interest in where pupils ended up and how they did, because quite a few of the lower performing settings used almost exactly similar language. We can't do that, we haven't got the capacity to do that. But then there were settings who were tracking, and they tended to be the high performing settings in terms of proportion of their students who went on to have a stable destination after leaving alternative provision. I will leave it there because I think I'm at 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to be here, and I think the further along you go in the lineup, the more you have to worry that someone's going to cover all your points. So I think it's a rich question though. I think you can come at it from quite a few angles, so I think that was a really good question to set, and all I'm going to do is probably speed over a few things that I think have been said quite a lot. But my starting point for thinking about this question was to think about variety and diversity, both in terms of the young people who access AP, and we've heard a lot about that, but also really about the sector itself and what it looks like. So we've just heard from Andy and from others, you know, this is a very diverse sector, so we do know that certain groups are overrepresented, but I suppose for the purposes of what I'm going to say, what I'm most interested in is that this is kind of a unifying factor or experience for these young people, which is that they've not flourished in the mainstream environment, or for some reason this environment has not met their needs. So that's the kind of thing I want to emphasize first of all. And then in terms of diversity of provision, I mean, it's such a rich sector, and I think we've started to hear some of that, but I really want to kind of draw that out a little bit more through what I'm going to say. So NFER back in 2013 found 15 types of AP, and I'm pretty sure that since then we could probably add some more kind of categories to that typology, and there's been lots of attempts to kind of create typologies about AP and try to kind of, I guess, put some organization on a sector that kind of is very hard to organize in a way. So we've already heard about some of the variable factors you can get in AP, so time spent in it, who enrolls, where it happens, program type, aims, purpose, content, whether enrollment is kind of voluntary or optional, or whether it's not, I think is an interesting one as well. I think the point I want to make here is that this diversity is actually integral to alternative provision and to the young people that it caters for, those young people that have not flourished in the mainstream system. But I also want to say that it's a characteristic of the sector which makes it really tricky and really challenging for those people that are trying to understand and manage quality in the sector, which is a big area of work at the moment. So I think that creates a real challenge for that work. And this is going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm really interested in the connections between work that's being done to understand and manage quality and that question of who AP is for. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So there's lots of work on this quality question. There's been lots of work over the past decade. And most recently, we see this in the integrated toolkit for quality in AP, which so parts of it came out last year and then the kind of full report this year. And then I think also you could see the green paper, so the latest green paper, as partly about trying to understand quality, although it's kind of couched more in the terms of clear standards, expectations, strengthened accountability. That's how the government have talked about what we will need from an AP sector if it becomes kind of part of an inclusive system, which is what they envisage. So there's a lot of kind of movement around this and a lot of work around this. I think the recent work, I think there's some real benefits to it. So one is that it's really sector informed, so it's drawn on quite a wide body of perspectives and views, lots of different organisations and lots of different practitioners and organisations. So I think that's a real strength. And I think that if you read the integrated kind of toolkit, they are really trying to emphasise that we can't really impose kind of ideas about what quality looks like from mainstream school into AP. That's probably not going to be the way to improve quality in this sector. But I think my kind of take or my sort of focus would be to kind of problematize or kind of ask some questions around some of the perhaps unintended outcomes of any work, whether it's policy or whether it's kind of system level that's trying to organize alternative provision, kind of put it into this sort of, I guess, put it into a system where we can manage its quality, because I think that we know from education policy that there often are unintended consequences of what government and others put in place. So I think the one I want to pick up on is that the government and Ofsted and Integrated have all highlighted that a gap in our understanding of AP is around that what, as we've already heard, described as unregistered provision. So that's one way of describing it. Pat Thompson and I kind of got some of this through the term complementary provision, which was where we were trying to think about provision that isn't trying to be a full-time entitlement for a young person, but kind of part of their educational picture. But we could also use the terminology of kind of, or we could also think about this end of the spectrum of AP being what caters for kind of what FFT education data would call kind of invisible or missing children in the system. So it's this kind of prevalent but kind of not very well understood part of the sector. So there's this acknowledgement that we don't understand this end of the sector very well, but these frameworks for quality and current policy are being developed. So they're being developed without a full understanding of the full spectrum of AP. So they're kind of being developed with this partial understanding, you could say. And there is a commitment to better understand that. So there is the consultation that I know Alice tweeted about. So, you know, that is going to get added in, but I think it's worth saying that at the moment, there's this kind of admission that that part of the sector isn't very well understood. So if you think of AP as a spectrum, I think we understand that part of it that perhaps resembles a school, or perhaps more closely resembles a school, or has elements that we recognise in our society as being kind of what we would expect young people to attend, you know, who are of compulsory education age. And I think we struggle to understand things that perhaps do not resemble that or are kind of further away from that. So yeah, in the unregistered part of that spectrum, we have a kind of set of quite ad hoc sometimes organisations that, if I just think about Nottingham, where I'm from, you know, we have an alternative provision that popped up one year, was connected to a youth work organisation that was catering for Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities, because they were there and they weren't in school. And so what else do? You know, I think there's that kind of element that this is a really responsive end of a kind of continuum of provision. And so I think also what it's important to kind of understand this part of the sector, this kind of almost, I guess, civil society response really to need in local areas, because I think it was Dan said, you know, it's also outside of accountability. And there's a real tension here, because that is both an issue, it's an issue in terms of safeguarding, safety, quality, we don't have oversight. But I would also say if we made more visible this provision, we could also understand what is happening in this provision that is perhaps really creative or really innovative or working really well for particular kinds of young people. So actually there's an argument for bringing it perhaps into or making it more visible from that perspective as well. And I think that's really important, because I suppose The questions I have are, will the existing sort of quality toolkit capture this area of alternative provision? Will it be able to do that? Will it be able to kind of be broad enough to sort of bring in kind of this ad hoc, this civil society sort of response that we might call unregistered? And if it does, you know, how will these APs be affected? How will they be affected by Department for Education's move for clearer standards and strengthened accountability? I'm really interested in that question. And I think we have to keep these questions in mind because, as I said at the beginning, AP is for a diverse group of young people, and diversity of provision is integral to the sector. And I suppose my concern is a little bit that, you know, as Stephen Ball argues, we often confuse education with schooling, and they're not the same thing. So I think we can find it difficult to imagine what education might look like without falling back on norms of schooling. And so we do need to be mindful that as this kind of work to understand and manage quality in the sector is happening, and is being applied more and more to this ad hoc or less familiar or less school-like end of the AP spectrum, that we don't lose what it is about these provisions that might, you know, play a really integral role in helping young people to flourish. Thank you.
So somebody has to go last, and it's great to be here. My name is Jenny Graham. I work for a charity called The Difference, and The Difference was founded to change the story on school exclusion. So we do many things, but amongst those things, one of the programs we run takes aspiring senior leaders from mainstream schools and places them into AP schools for 2 years with lots of kind of CPD and support around them, and then mentors them back into mainstream roles is the intention, with a focus that they will be leading inclusion in mainstream roles and that they will take a lot of the learning from AP with them into those mainstream school roles in the future. So I do research for The Difference, which involves kind of looking at sector-wide research as well as our programmes research. And I'm going to echo on a lot of the themes other speakers have picked up, and I'll try and kind of gloss over things that they've already done really well already, because you really don't need to hear it again. But I think there's some really important themes that we're hearing around invisibility and about data and about accountability and how that relates to safeguarding. And I too, like Sarah, want to sort of interrogate the question a bit more. So the AP landscape, as everyone said, is complex. To put some hard numbers on it, there were in DfE data 32,000 students across at least 761 institutions. And you'll notice the language around at least, because we don't know the full extent, as other speakers have talked about. There's a national rate of around 2.7 students for every 1,000 students are educated in AP, but there's massive variation in that too. So the biggest area last year was North East Lincolnshire, where there were 7.7 students for every 1,000 pupils who were educated in AP. So the end of the spectrum, unlike what Jody was talking about, that we often concentrate on the difference, is the other end. So what is often sort of the kind of PRU end of AP sector. And here there are 338 institutions that DfE categorise in that kind of PRU category that are either maintained pupil referral units or alternative provision academy schools. And in those schools last year, and this is quite a drop from what had happened pre-COVID, there were just under 12,000 students, so around 11,700 students, but this counts only students with their sole and main registration in a PRU, so not those who have dual registration with a mainstream school. The number is therefore likely to be quite a lot bigger, and again, it's not something we can see in the data very easily. So the question about who AP is for, and similarly what is AP for, really kind of depends on the intersection of your educational philosophy and your position in the educational landscape. Perhaps more useful, the approach I thought of taking here was to look at who is in AP, why are those students there and what happens to them, and you know, to then ask, are we happy with the answers to that? And if not, are there things that could be changed? So to start with, I think it's really interesting to note that we often think about pupil referral units and that sector of the AP sector as schools for excluded students. Now, just under 4,000 students were permanently excluded, formally permanently excluded in the last academic year. And you'll notice that that is a lot smaller than the number of students who are in this sector of AP. So there are around 3 times more students who are in these PRU AP schools than were formerly permanently excluded. So how do the others end up there, which is a really important question that we need to ask. They're not in official exclusions data. We can't see what's happening. We have no kind of zoomed out view from official data. And that's really important about this, around this kind of invisibility narrative. We think that lots of them are ending up there with alternatives to permanent exclusion, which may be very well intentioned by their mainstream schools to destigmatize the move that they may be having, because we know there are all sorts of stigmas that go with permanent exclusion. However, you could argue that in some of these circumstances for some of these students, there is still social exclusion and potential stigma. There is still impact on their self-esteem, and a very sudden loss of their school-based peer network and the community in a mainstream school to which they have and should have belonged is taken away rapidly. So arguably as a form of exclusion. And this is part of a bigger picture around unseen exclusion that doesn't show up in our official statistics at the moment. So the Educational Policy Institute, and someone mentioned Joe Hutchinson earlier's work in 2019 on unexplained exits in the broader education system, indicate a really high rate of exits from schools. As many as 1 in 10 students disappear from schools in ways that don't look like house moves and don't have kind of other formal coding in the MPD databases. So this is a high number of students, and nearly 40% of these students, which equates to around 26,000, much bigger than the AP pre-sector, disappear from school roles and don't reappear on any school role. And I think when we look at the whole kind of sector, we need to think about invisibility, and we need to think about other forms of exclusion, and we need to think about what is happening. So I won't spend too long on here because other people have talked about this, but maybe some hard figures are helpful. Just to look at the difference in the profile of the population in this sector of the PRU AP sector, so that kind of 11,700 students rather than the whole sector, for which we don't have these numbers. So around over half of the students are entitled to free school meals, which means that they come from low-income households, compared to under a quarter in the whole pupil population. And you can see that the SEN support levels there are much, much higher, and it raises a lot of questions about what's happening in mainstream schools when these SEN designation labels happen, and why they happen, how mainstream schools are supporting them, or whether they're seeing them. And we know from some of our AP partners that a lot of the work they do in AP is around diagnosing and seeking assessment for these kind of special educational needs when students arrive with them. So these may be special educational needs in some cases that are missed by their mainstream schools, and when students arrive, it's being picked up on. And similarly with an educational health care plan. It's also really interesting to note the kind of gender balance, although again, and there's a really interesting paper by Social Finance where you can see that in other forms of exclusion that aren't in the official data, the gender balance is very different actually. So persistent absence and managed moves are much more gender balanced than permanent exclusion would be, and then the population in this sector of AP is. I totally take the point about GCSEs not being necessarily the best outcome measure for across the sector, but I think it is interesting to note that a grade 5 or above in English and maths that equates to a kind of good C in the old scoring system, the rate is very different in AP than it is across the all pupil population. And the positive destination in the autumn term post Key Stage 4, which is again earlier than, as Andy was saying, is necessarily useful to measure, but it's when people are required to measure it. Again, is very, very different. And that DFE data that Andy also referred to, the MOJ database there, looks at the conviction and caution by around the age of 19 as 41% from students who've experienced alternative provision, and 59% from those who've been permanently excluded, compared to 5% of all population by the time that they're 19. That's a really marked difference. And correlation is not causation, but there's something very important going on there that we need to think about very carefully. I won't go on to the entered for EBAC question. So what we can see essentially is that those students in this part of the AP sector are those who've been excluded, but that exclusion is complex and it's unexplained sometimes and it's invisible sometimes. And it would be really, really useful in order to help with quality and lots of other questions and accountability and safeguarding to know a lot more about how that's happening. They're more likely to be male, they're more likely to have special educational needs and come from lower income families. And they're on an academic route that's divergent from their higher performing peers. AP can be there to reintegrate back into the mainstream, but we don't know how well that's working because there isn't any data on it. And the current educational landscape, both in terms of policy and practice, doesn't comprehensively facilitate this. And while moves in the Green Paper are very welcome, We've heard a lot of our AP partners kind of question the mechanisms and structures that are going to be there to help them achieve this, and the accountability that's there between mainstream schools and LAs and APs too. So for us, 3 key questions emerge then. Is this what we want AP to do, this sector, this part of the AP sector? And we would argue the difference, probably not. Without negating the fact that AP is a really important and beneficial setting for some students, that there's question about whether all the students who are currently in AP actually are benefiting the most from AP. So is the number of students at the right level? And if not, could it look different? So to finish, what if regulatory and performance frameworks in mainstream schools, accountability, structural accountability in mainstream schools placed much higher value on inclusion? What if our school leaders were better placed to bring the same rigor that they have around teaching and learning behaviour sometimes to inclusion? What if we enabled and supported and allowed our school practitioners to develop their relational practices that happen so well in quality AP into the mainstream that benefit all, particularly the most vulnerable students for whom positive relationships are likely to make the biggest difference? And what if all school practitioners were trained and supported to understand the causes of challenging behaviour and to respond to that as a need and as a communication rather than as a violation of behaviour policy? And what if our schools had the resources to draw on in and out of school to properly support students early on with all of the things that might make it harder to access learning? If we had that, then who would this part of AP be for?